In this video, we're going to have a look at a few useful loop calculations. So you will see that I created a new project. I created a package called com.example.calculations, and then I created 4 different Java files. So how do you create a Java file again? I just right click and say new, and then you go to Java class. So right click new Java class, and then you create your new class. So I created a class for input validation, running totals, sentinel values, and user control loops. So we're going to go through every one of them. First one, input validation, and then some running totals or user controlled loop, then running totals, and then sentinel values. So for all of them, I just created the public static void main method there. You can see all of them has just got the main method, and we will start coding from there. So the first example that we're going to have a look at is input validation. So we're validating the input that the user will give us. So in this case, we're just going to ask the user for a specific question. So I'm going to have a string to get whatever the user types. So I'm going to say string input equals joptionpane dot show input dialog, and we're going to ask the user, please enter a number. And I'm going to go to a new line here. Yours can fit into one line, that's fine. Please enter a number in the range of 1 through 100. Let's say that's the question that we ask. The user must enter a number in the range of 1 to 100. And then whatever the user typed, we're going to save that into the input variable. But now we want to have that number. So I'm going to say integer number equals. So we need to convert whatever the user typed now to an integer. So I'm going to say integer dot parseInt, and we're going to pass in that input, which means it's going to convert the input that the user typed to an integer and save it into the variable called number. So now we want to validate this input that the user has given us, because we're asking enter a number in the range of 1 to 100. This could be a date of birth or whatever you want to check so that the months don't go over 12 or whatever. So in this case, it must not go less than 1, also not higher than 100. So we can use a simple while loop to check this now. So I'm going to say while the number variable is less than 1, or remember, if we're checking for outside a range, we use the OR operator. So we're checking whether while the number is less than 1 or the number is greater than 100. So let's say the guy enters 2000 there. Then the number is not less than 1, but the number is more than 100. And remember, for the OR operator to be true, either one of the two sides needs to be true. So I'm testing now whether this number that the user entered is less than 1 outside of the range, or more than 100 also outside of the range. So if it is, then we need to do something. So I'm going to print out, just using a normal joptionpane.show message dialog. Let's say null there for the first argument, and we'll say something like that number is, just go to a new line again, that number is not valid. And then directly after that, we're going to have the user enter that same thing again. So we're going to ask the user again, please enter a number from 1 to 100. We're not going to declare the variable again, but just use it. And then we're also going to use that same variable there again to get that input as an integer. So what happens here? We're basically saying if that number is less than 1 or more than 100, we print out the number is not valid. And then we ask the user, please enter a number in the range of 1 through 100. He enters it, we convert it again to a number, and then the loop runs again. It tests again. Is that number less than 1 or greater than 100? If it's again outside of the range, we will say again the number is not valid, and please enter new value. Can you see it's working the same as an if statement by testing? But now we're testing it over and over and over again until the user gives us the number that we actually want, which is a number in the range of 1 to 100. Okay, so let's look at the loop control variable here. Can you see this is the loop control variable? The number variable is initialized to whatever the user's input is. So that's the loop control variable. It's been initialized. Then we test the loop control variable. There's number again. And then somewhere we must change the loop control variable again. So here we get a new input again, we're changing the value and then testing again to make sure that we do not get into an infinite loop. So let's test out this program quickly. Okay, so now it asks, please enter a number in the range of 1 to 100. So let's say 101. It says that number is not valid. Please enter a number in the range of 1 to 100. Let's say 2,000. 200. Still bigger than 100. That number is not valid. Can you see it will keep on popping up this J option pane? Keep on asking me. That's because we're in a loop now. It will keep on asking me until I give the correct number. So if I put a 0 there, which is less than 1, it's also not valid, and it asks me again. But if I type the value of 50 now, that is a number between 1 and 100, and the loop will exit. Nothing else will happen. So after the loop, we can just say joptionpane.show message dialog. Let's say null there. Correct. Okay, so if we run that again, and it is correct, it will go outside of the loop and basically gives us that J option pane. So let's say 40 now, which is inside of the range, correct, and we're done. But if we're not correct, it will keep on asking us using that loop to enter the correct value. So if I say 2,000 again, it's going to keep on asking me, please enter a number that's correct, and it will keep on asking until I give a number that's correct. Right, so for the next example, we will be looking at a user-controlled loop. So the input validation example that we just did is actually also a user-controlled loop, because the loop runs basically how many times the user chose to not enter the valid number. But this one is a bit more direct to user-controlled loops. So this is basically how we ask the user to say, okay, how many times do you want this loop to run? And then we run the loop that specific number of times. So this is a user-controlled loop. So I'm just going to use a simple example, and I'm going to use a maximum value, and we're going to ask the maximum value from the user. So I'm going to use a J option pane, let's say string input again, input, and get the input from the user. So we're going to say J option pane dot show input dialog, get input from the user. And now what do we want to ask the user? So for this example, we just basically going to ask the user, how high should I go? So we ask the user to type a number there, and we're going to square the number. How should I go to square the number? How high should I go to square the number? Okay, so that's basically the input. And now the maximum value we will set to let's just convert that one, integer dot parseInt, and we're going to convert that integer value, or that string value, to an integer. So now we have the maximum value to say how high should we go in squaring numbers. Now for this example, I'm just going to use a normal system out print line to print out the results. I'm going to have something like number at the top, and then let's put some 1, 2, maybe 3 tabs there, and then I'm going to have number squared. So we're going to have the number and the number squared printed out to the screen. So let's just have a system out print line there again, and we will just have a line there to underline that part, and then we'll have our for loop. Now remember, for a for loop, we basically use a for loop if you know exactly how many times to execute the for loop. Do we know how many times to execute the for loop? Yes, it's that max value. So we want to execute, let's say the users say, I want to go as high as 5, which means I want to print out 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, and 5 squared. Okay, so that also makes a difference on where do I start my for loop. So my for loop will obviously start at 1. So I'm going to say integer, and let's call it I, and that's the number that we want to square. So maybe let's call it number, equals 1 instead of 0 in the previous examples, because we want to have not 0 squared, but 1 squared, 2 squared, and so forth. And then I'm going to go to number less than or equal to the maximum value. So that's how many times I want to run this thing, and then we need to say number plus plus. So we're going to start off at 1 and then check if the number is less than the maximum value. So let's say the user enters here. Let's say the user enters a 4. So if he enters the 4, then our number will start at a 1. We will check, is that number less than or equal 4? Yes, it is. And then we will square the number. Then we increment the number, make it 1 more. So then number becomes 2 and we square the 2. Then number becomes a 3 and we square the 3. And when it gets to 4, is the number less than or equal 4? Yes, it is. So it will square 4 as well. But then when we go to 5, 5 is not less than or equal the 4, and then it will stop running. So that's essentially what we want to do here. So I'm just going to print out here number. Sorry, that's without double quotation marks. It's whatever is in the number at that stage. Remember, the user maybe typed a 4, so right at the beginning that number, the maximum value would be 4, but the number starts at 1 and then gets incremented the whole time. So that number we're going to use plus, and now to simulate those tabs that I used there, you can just use a backslash T and a backslash T again. That's 2 tabs. So let's try 3 tabs there as well. And then after that, we'll have number squared. So it's number times number, and that will be the number. So let's see how this one prints out now. I'm going to run it. I'm going to ask the user, okay, please enter. Okay, sorry, that one is still running, the user, the input validation one. So let's click the run button there. We run the user controlled loop. How high should I go? Let's say 4, and you can see there's the number and the number squared. So let's make a bit more tabs there. 1 more tab. Let's see again. Let's say 4 again, and that's okay. So we've got the number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the number squared is 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, and 4 squared. Okay, so this is just a user control loop where we ask the user basically, how many times do we want to use or to run the loop? And I'm using that value as the maximum value in my loop as the value that I need to test for. And now we know, well, while that number is less than that one, we will keep on executing, so we know exactly how many times we want to run this. So if I wanted to run this loop also 4 times again, I could have started at 0 there, but 0 squared is not a value that we want. And then if I start at 0, I must leave out the equal sign there. So that's another way of doing it, and then I must add 1 to the number the whole time. So this is a better way of just saying, let's start at 1, but then we include the equal sign there in order to run it that amount of times that the user said we should run it.